The moment someone assumes they know your limits is often the moment they reveal their own. The lunch crowd flowed through one of Manhattan's most elegant restaurants with the familiar rhythm of polished silverware, quiet conversations, and soft piano music drifting beneath the afternoon sunlight. Every table seemed wrapped in comfort except one. Nathan Cole, a 43-year-old billionaire investor and devoted single father, sat near the window with a thick investment report spread across the white linen tablecloth instead of a menu. Across from him sat his 10-year-old son, Oliver, patiently stirring a glass of iced tea while watching his father study page after page of financial projections. Nathan barely noticed the food arriving. A multi-billion-dollar acquisition depended upon the numbers resting beneath his fingertips, and somewhere inside the report, he felt something refused to fit. He circled several figures with an expensive fountain pen before quietly shaking his head. "This does not make sense," he murmured to himself. Oliver leaned forward with innocent curiosity. "Is something wrong?" Nathan offered a distracted smile. "Probably nothing. Just a complicated analysis." At that same moment, Grace Miller approached, carrying a tray balanced carefully on one hand. She wore a spotless white shirt beneath a neatly pressed black apron, her blonde hair tied back simply, her expression calm, attentive, almost invisible among the constant movement of the restaurant. She placed fresh coffee beside Nathan without interrupting his concentration. As she gently adjusted the cup, her eyes naturally drifted toward the open report for less than a second. She immediately looked away and quietly apologized. "Excuse me." Nathan noticed the brief glance. He lifted his eyes from the report and studied the shy waitress standing beside his table. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. She looked like hundreds of hard-working servers across the city. Yet something about the way she had paused over one specific page caught his attention. "Did you recognize something?" he asked. Grace hesitated politely. "No, sir. I only happened to notice one chart while setting down your coffee." Nathan leaned back slightly, folding his arms. A faint smile crossed his face, though it carried more skepticism than warmth. "Do you even understand this?" The question hung quietly in the air. Nearby conversations continued, but Oliver instinctively looked from his father to Grace. Several guests seated close enough to hear the exchange subtly glanced toward the table before pretending to return to their meals. Grace remained perfectly still. She neither defended herself nor appeared offended. Instead, she looked respectfully toward the report again. "Only a little," she answered softly. Nathan slid the document a few inches closer across the table. "Then tell me what you think." Oliver watched with growing curiosity. Grace hesitated for only a heartbeat before lowering her eyes to the highlighted page. Her voice remained gentle. "The revenue forecast is not the part one would worry about." Nathan's confident expression barely changed. "Really?" Grace nodded almost imperceptibly. "The projected growth assumes customer retention will remain above 94% after the merger." Nathan answered immediately. "That is exactly what the consultants estimated." Grace looked at the chart once more before speaking with remarkable calm. "Yes, but page 47 quietly changes the renewal definition. Existing contracts shorter than 12 months are excluded from the calculation. That makes the retention rate appear stronger than it actually is." Silence settled over the table. Nathan slowly turned to page 47. Oliver leaned closer without saying a word. Grace took a single respectful step backward. "I am sorry if I misunderstood," she said quietly. "Enjoy your lunch." She turned to continue serving another table exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. Nathan never answered. His eyes remained fixed on the report as he reread the footnote Grace had noticed within seconds. The small paragraph had escaped his legal team, his analysts, and even his own careful review. Oliver looked first at the report, then toward the quiet waitress walking calmly across the restaurant with her black apron tied neatly at her waist. For the first time that afternoon, the smartest person in the room no longer seemed to be wearing the most expensive suit. Grace Miller finished her shift nearly 3 hours after Nathan Cole and his son had left the restaurant. She untied her black apron only after every table had been cleaned, every coffee machine had been shut down, and every chair had been placed neatly beneath its table. While several co-workers hurried toward the employee exit, Grace quietly remained behind to help a new server fold fresh linen napkins for the breakfast shift. "You should go home," the young server said apologetically. You already worked enough today. Grace smiled gently while stacking another pile of napkins. Tomorrow always arrives a little easier when today ends well. The young woman laughed softly, grateful for the help. Grace finally stepped outside into the cool Manhattan evening, carrying a small canvas bag over one shoulder. She boarded the subway with dozens of strangers returning home after long workdays. No one noticed the worn financial textbook resting inside her bag. The edges of its pages had softened from years of careful reading, and colorful handwritten notes filled nearly every margin. Grace found an empty seat beside the window and quietly opened the book to the same chapter she had studied many times before. Around her, passengers scrolled through their phones or closed their eyes after exhausting days. Grace instead spent the 30-minute ride reviewing valuation models and corporate governance case studies, occasionally underlining another sentence with a simple mechanical pencil. When the train reached her neighborhood, she walked several quiet blocks to a modest apartment building where flowers grew in small boxes beneath the windows despite the crowded streets surrounding them. Her apartment was simple but carefully organized. A wooden bookshelf stood beside the kitchen table, holding finance textbooks, library books, and several framed family photographs. Grace placed her canvas bag on the chair before watering the small herbs growing beside the window. Only then did she begin preparing a modest dinner. While pasta simmered gently on the stove, she opened an old notebook filled with neatly organized calculations, investment articles clipped from newspapers, and personal observations written late at night after work. There were no complaints on those pages. Only questions, ideas, and lessons she hoped never to forget. One sentence had been written across the top of a page years earlier. Knowledge becomes wisdom only after humility teaches it patience. Grace paused for a moment before smiling quietly to herself. She remembered writing those words during college when life still seemed to follow the future she had imagined. Her phone vibrated softly on the kitchen counter. It was a reminder from the public library confirming that 2 new books on behavioral economics would be available for pickup the following afternoon. Grace immediately accepted the reservation. She always believed learning should continue whether anyone rewarded it or not. After dinner, she sat beside the apartment window overlooking the evening traffic below. The city glowed with endless lights, each window hiding another untold story. Grace reopened the same financial report chapter she had studied on the subway, comparing several formulas with handwritten notes she had made months earlier. She never imagined the knowledge would become important inside a restaurant. She simply enjoyed understanding how businesses succeeded or quietly failed beneath the surface. Before going to bed, she carefully placed the textbook back inside her canvas bag beside the neatly folded black apron she would wear again in the morning. Tomorrow would look almost exactly like today. She would greet strangers with a smile, refill coffee cups, remember regular customers by name, and continue living a life that appeared perfectly ordinary. Unaware that somewhere across Manhattan a billionaire was rereading page 47 of the same report for the 5th time that evening, Grace turned off the light, believing their brief conversation had already become nothing more than another forgotten moment in an ordinary day. The next morning, Nathan Cole arrived at the headquarters of Cole Capital before most of the executive team had reached the building. The city was only beginning to wake beneath a pale gray sky, but the lights inside the top-floor conference room were already glowing. A fresh copy of the acquisition report rested on the polished walnut table, with dozens of handwritten notes filling the margins. Nathan had barely slept. The quiet waitress from the restaurant had occupied his thoughts far more than the billion-dollar transaction itself. He had reviewed the report 6 separate times during the night, and every review led him back to the same overlooked paragraph on page 47. Grace Miller had been right. Not approximately right. Completely right. The retention formula quietly excluded thousands of short-term contracts, making the projected stability appear far stronger than reality justified. Nathan stood beside the conference room window overlooking Manhattan as his senior executives entered one by one. His chief financial officer placed another folder on the table. The legal department completed its review early this morning, she said confidently. Nathan remained silent for several moments before turning toward the team. Show me the customer retention assumptions again. Several executives exchanged curious glances. One analyst projected the familiar presentation onto the large screen. Charts, forecasts, and market trends filled the room. Nathan listened carefully before raising one calm question. How many contracts under 12 months were excluded from these calculations? The room became unexpectedly quiet. The analyst hesitated before scrolling through several pages. I would have to verify that. Nathan nodded slowly. Please do. 10 uncomfortable minutes passed while laptops opened and spreadsheets appeared across the conference table. Finally, the analyst looked up with visible concern. The shorter contracts were excluded according to an appendix buried inside the supporting documents. Nathan folded his hands calmly. Would including them materially change the forecast? The chief financial officer quietly recalculated several numbers before looking toward him with surprise. Yes, significantly. Another executive leaned forward. That adjustment would reduce projected customer retention below the threshold required by our acquisition model. Silence settled over the conference room. Every experienced executive present had studied the report for weeks. Every consultant had approved the recommendation. Yet a quiet waitress carrying coffee had recognized the hidden weakness almost instantly. Nathan dismissed the meeting early with instructions to suspend the acquisition until every assumption had been independently verified. As the executives filed out, his longtime assistant remained behind. She had worked beside Nathan for more than a decade and recognized the thoughtful expression he rarely revealed. Something else is bothering you, she observed gently. Nathan looked toward the report resting on the table. Yesterday, a waitress noticed what none of us did. His assistant smiled politely, assuming he was exaggerating. Nathan slid the report toward her and pointed to page 47. She found this in less than a minute. The assistant studied the page before raising her eyebrows. How? Nathan answered honestly. That is exactly what I intend to discover. Meanwhile, across the city, Grace tied her familiar black apron before the breakfast rush began. She greeted regular customers with the same warm smile, poured fresh coffee, and carefully tucked the worn financial textbook deeper into her canvas bag inside the employee locker. She never imagined that one quiet observation spoken with humility had already altered the course of a billion-dollar decision. To her, the conversation had ended the moment she returned to serving tables. To Nathan, however, it had only just begun. Somewhere between the polished boardroom and the modest restaurant, two completely different worlds had collided for less than 60 seconds, and neither of them would ever be quite the same again. 3 days passed before Nathan Cole returned to the restaurant. He arrived at the same table near the window shortly after noon, this time carrying no acquisition report, only a slim notebook and an open mind that still struggled to accept what had happened. Oliver walked beside him with the same quiet curiosity he had shown during their previous visit. As they sat down, Oliver immediately recognized Grace Miller arranging fresh flowers near the entrance. She wore the same spotless white shirt and neatly tied black apron, moving through the dining room with calm confidence that never asked for attention. She greeted every customer exactly the same way, whether they wore expensive business suits or simple work clothes. Nathan watched quietly for several minutes before Grace approached their table with menus. "Welcome back," she said warmly. "It is nice to see you again." There was no trace of discomfort in her voice. She behaved as though their unusual conversation several days earlier had simply become another ordinary memory. Nathan looked up. "Thank you." Grace poured fresh water into their glasses before preparing to leave, but Nathan spoke again. "Would you mind answering another question?" Grace paused politely. "If I can." Nathan reached into his briefcase and removed a single sheet of paper covered with several financial ratios. They were not confidential information, only a simplified scenario based on market conditions. He gently slid the page across the table. Imagine this company suddenly loses 15% of its largest customers during the first year after a merger. What would concern you most? Oliver looked at his father with surprise. The question sounded more like something asked inside a graduate classroom than a restaurant. Grace glanced at the page for only a few seconds. She never touched it. "May I answer honestly?" she asked. Nathan nodded. "Please." Grace spoke quietly enough that nearby diners could continue enjoying their meals undisturbed. Most people would focus on replacing lost revenue. Nathan listened carefully. "Would you?" Grace gently shook her head. "No. I would first ask why those customers left. Revenue is usually the result. Trust is usually the cause." Nathan remained silent. Grace continued with calm certainty. If leadership only repairs financial statements without repairing confidence, the same pattern often repeats itself. Oliver slowly smiled. That makes sense. Nathan leaned back in his chair. How did you learn to think that way? Grace hesitated before answering. By reading, listening, making mistakes, and paying attention. She smiled gently. Numbers tell important stories, but people usually explain why those stories happen. Before Nathan could ask another question, another table signaled for assistance. Grace offered an apologetic smile. Excuse me, someone needs fresh coffee. She quietly walked away, carrying the empty pitcher toward the kitchen with the same steady pace as before. Nathan watched her disappear through the swinging doors. One of his business associates happened to enter the restaurant unexpectedly and recognized him immediately. The executive approached the table, surprised to find the billionaire discussing finance with a waitress moments earlier. Nathan, he said with a friendly laugh, surely you are not interviewing restaurant staff for investment advice. Nathan looked toward Grace, serving an elderly couple across the dining room, before answering with complete sincerity. No, I am learning what happens when wisdom arrives wearing an apron instead of a tailored suit. Oliver lowered his eyes toward his glass, quietly smiling, because for the first time he could remember, his father sounded less interested in proving how much he knew and far more interested in discovering how much he still had to learn. Oliver Cole could not stop thinking about Grace Miller during the drive home. The city moved past the car windows in long streams of afternoon traffic, yet his thoughts remained inside the quiet restaurant where a waitress wearing a simple black apron had answered every difficult question with remarkable calm. Finally, he looked toward his father. Dad, why did you keep testing her? Nathan Cole kept both hands on the steering wheel for a few silent seconds before answering. Because I wanted to know whether the first time was luck. Oliver tilted his head thoughtfully. And was it? Nathan smiled faintly. No. Luck usually disappears after the second question. The conversation ended there, but Oliver quietly opened the sketchbook resting on his lap. He began drawing Grace from memory. He carefully sketched the black apron, the calm smile, and the old canvas bag he had noticed beside the employee lockers when they walked past the service hallway. Beneath the drawing, he wrote only one sentence. She saw what everyone else walked past. The following afternoon, Nathan returned to his office, determined to finish the acquisition review. This time, every projection, every chart, and every assumption received slower attention than before. He noticed something unexpected inside himself. Instead of asking whether the analysts were experienced enough, he had begun asking whether anyone had challenged the assumptions carefully enough. Grace had quietly changed the way he evaluated information. Late that afternoon, his assistant entered carrying several folders. The revised numbers are complete, she said. Nathan reviewed them carefully before nodding. The acquisition would have cost us hundreds of millions if we had accepted the original projections. His assistant looked genuinely surprised. I still cannot believe such a small footnote changed everything. Nathan closed the folder thoughtfully. It was never the footnote. She looked confused. Nathan continued quietly. It was the willingness to notice what everyone else assumed did not matter. Meanwhile, Grace's afternoon continued like every other shift. She welcomed families celebrating birthdays, helped an elderly gentleman read the dessert menu without making him feel embarrassed, and patiently listened while a young couple debated which meal to order. She remembered favorite drinks, children's names, and regular customers' anniversaries without writing anything down. Her coworkers often wondered how she remembered so much. Grace always answered the same way. People remember when someone remembers them. During a brief break, she stepped outside behind the restaurant carrying a small paperback book from her canvas bag. Instead of scrolling through her phone, she spent 10 quiet minutes reading another chapter on behavioral economics before returning to work. One of the cooks smiled as she walked back inside. You never stop studying, do you? Grace laughed softly. Not if I can help it. The cook shook his head with admiration. Most people stop learning after school. Grace gently closed the book. School teaches us where to begin. Curiosity decides whether we continue. That evening, Oliver surprised his father by placing the finished drawing on the kitchen table during dinner. Nathan studied the picture carefully. Grace stood beside a restaurant table while dozens of business executives walked past without noticing a tiny missing puzzle piece lying on the floor. Only she had stopped to pick it up. Nathan looked at his son. Why a puzzle piece? Oliver shrugged. Because everyone thought they had the whole picture already. Nathan quietly smiled. His son had unknowingly described exactly what had happened. Before going to bed that night, Nathan found himself wondering a question he had never expected to ask. If Grace possessed this much understanding about business, numbers, and people, what path had led someone with such remarkable insight to spend her days quietly serving coffee instead of leading the conversations taking place inside boardrooms only a few miles away? The question Nathan Cole had asked himself the previous night refused to disappear. It followed him through executive meetings, investment reviews, and conversations that normally demanded his complete attention. How had a woman with such extraordinary insight ended up quietly serving coffee in a Manhattan restaurant? The thought lingered until he finally called his longtime executive assistant into his office. She had worked beside him for nearly 12 years and understood the difference between ordinary curiosity and genuine importance. "I need your help," Nathan said calmly. She opened her notebook. "Of course." Nathan paused before continuing. "There is a waitress named Grace Miller." His assistant looked up with mild surprise, but waited respectfully. "I want to understand her background." He immediately added another sentence. "Only public information. No private investigators. No invading her life. If something belongs to her alone, we leave it alone." His assistant nodded. "Understood." Meanwhile, Grace's life continued exactly as it always had. Before sunrise, she walked to the neighborhood public library carrying the same worn canvas bag she brought everywhere. The building had only recently opened, yet the librarian greeted her with a familiar smile. "Good morning, Grace. Your books are waiting." Grace thanked her before checking out 2 volumes on corporate governance and behavioral finance. She carefully placed them beside the old textbook already inside her bag. The librarian laughed softly. "You have probably read every finance book we own." Grace smiled with quiet humility. "Not yet." She glanced affectionately toward the shelves. "There is always another perspective waiting." An hour later she arrived at the restaurant, tied on her neatly pressed black apron, and greeted every co-worker by name before the breakfast rush began. Nothing about her appearance suggested she spent nearly every free moment studying subjects far removed from food service. To the customers, she remained simply the quiet waitress who remembered favorite meals and refilled coffee before anyone asked. Late that afternoon, Nathan's assistant quietly returned carrying a slim folder. "I only found publicly available information," she said. Nathan accepted it and opened the first page. Grace Miller had graduated from high school with exceptional academic honors and received a prestigious scholarship to study finance at a respected university. Her professors had consistently praised her analytical ability, leadership, and unusual emotional intelligence. Nathan turned the page. His expression slowly changed. Grace had completed 3 years of university with outstanding results before suddenly withdrawing from the program. No disciplinary record appeared. No academic difficulties. No explanation beyond a simple voluntary withdrawal. Another page contained a list of community volunteer activities completed during the years that followed. Literacy tutoring, financial education workshops at neighborhood centers, weekend meal programs. Everything had been done quietly, with little public recognition. Nathan closed the folder for a moment before looking toward the city beyond his office window. "There is still a missing chapter," he said quietly. His assistant nodded. "Yes, the records explain what happened. They do not explain why." That same evening, Oliver waited for his father at home while finishing his homework at the dining room table. Nathan entered carrying the folder beneath one arm. Oliver noticed the thoughtful expression immediately. "Did you learn more about Grace?" Nathan sat beside him. "Only enough to know there is much more to her story." Oliver smiled gently. "I think some people become interesting because they never try to be." Nathan looked toward his son with quiet admiration. Children often reached simple truths adults complicated. Across the city, Grace sat beside her apartment window after another long shift, reading beneath the warm light of a small desk lamp. Outside, Manhattan hurried through another ordinary evening. Inside, she quietly turned another page, completely unaware that someone who had once questioned whether she understood a financial report had now begun searching for the story behind the remarkable mind that noticed what an entire boardroom had failed to see. The unanswered question remained quietly suspended between 2 very different lives. Nathan Cole now understood that Grace Miller possessed remarkable knowledge, Yet the reason behind her unfinished journey still escaped him. He refused to make assumptions. Experience had taught him that facts without context often became unfair judgments. Several days later, his assistant returned carrying another thin folder. "This is everything that is publicly available," she said gently. "There is not much." Nathan thanked her before opening the final pages. A local newspaper article from several years earlier described a scholarship recipient who had withdrawn from college after unexpected family circumstances. No names of relatives appeared. Another community newsletter mentioned a volunteer who spent weekends teaching financial literacy to teenagers without accepting payment. Grace's name appeared only once in small print near the bottom of the page. There were no interviews, no photographs celebrating her work, and no social media accounts documenting her accomplishments. Nathan slowly closed the folder. "She never tried to be noticed," he murmured. His assistant nodded. It seemed she preferred making a difference over receiving recognition. Across the city, Grace began another ordinary shift. The lunch crowd arrived earlier than usual, and every table quickly filled with conversations, business meetings, birthday celebrations, and quiet family lunches. She moved calmly through the dining room, greeting familiar faces while helping new guests feel welcome. An elderly customer struggled to read the menu without his glasses. Grace quietly offered to describe the daily specials instead of drawing attention to his difficulty. At another table, a nervous young man rehearsed a job interview while waiting for a friend. Grace noticed his anxious expression and simply smiled as she refilled his coffee. "Take your time," she said warmly. "The right words usually arrive after we stop chasing them." The young man laughed with visible relief. She never realized that Nathan and Oliver had entered the restaurant only moments earlier. This time, they chose a table farther away, allowing Nathan to observe without interrupting her work. Oliver watched Grace moving from table to table with the same quiet patience she had shown during every previous visit. "She treats everyone exactly the same," he whispered. Nathan nodded. "That is becoming harder to ignore." As they waited for lunch, another businessman recognized Nathan and stopped beside the table. "Nathan, I heard you delayed the acquisition." Nathan smiled politely. "We discovered something important before signing." The businessman laughed confidently. "Good analysts are worth every dollar." Nathan glanced across the room toward Grace, who was carefully helping a little girl choose between two desserts. Sometimes the best analysis comes from someone nobody thinks to ask. The businessman followed his gaze, but only saw a waitress carrying a tray. He smiled politely without understanding and soon returned to his own meeting. Oliver quietly noticed something his father had missed. Between serving customers, Grace occasionally removed a folded index card from her apron pocket and read a few handwritten notes before placing it back. It lasted only seconds each time. "Dad," Oliver whispered, "she is studying while she works." Nathan looked more carefully. Sure enough, during every brief pause between tables, Grace reviewed another small note card before returning to greet the next guest with complete attention. There was no wasted moment. Every spare minute became another opportunity to learn. Nathan felt an unexpected sense of admiration growing inside him. Wealth had allowed him access to the finest universities, consultants, and mentors. Grace, without any of those advantages, had built her knowledge one quiet page at a time while carrying coffee and clearing tables. Watching her that afternoon, Nathan finally understood that intelligence was not measured by the place where someone worked. It was measured by the discipline to keep learning long after the world stopped expecting anything remarkable from you. Somewhere inside that realization, another question quietly appeared. If Grace had taught herself this much while serving strangers every day, what extraordinary future might still be waiting for her if someone finally chose to see her beyond the apron she wore? That quiet question followed Nathan Cole home and stayed with him long after the restaurant lights faded behind the evening traffic. He had spent years believing that talent naturally rose to the surface, yet Grace Miller challenged that belief without ever trying to. The following Monday morning, a routine conference call interrupted his thoughts. The acquisition team had completed one final review before the board meeting scheduled for the end of the week. Nathan listened carefully as the lead attorney summarized several revised documents. Everything appeared ready for approval. Then one sentence caught his attention. The attorney casually mentioned an optional governance amendment that would become active 18 months after the merger. Nathan immediately remembered the calm way Grace had spoken about hidden assumptions instead of obvious numbers. He requested a complete copy of the amendment before ending the meeting. Less than an hour later, he sat alone reading the additional documents. Buried beneath dozens of pages of technical language, he discovered a voting provision that could quietly reduce his company's influence if several future conditions aligned. It was completely legal, yet strategically dangerous. Nathan slowly leaned back in his chair. The amendment had never appeared in the executive summary because it was considered unlikely to matter. He stared silently through the office window before closing the file. Grace had unknowingly changed the way he examined every important decision. He no longer asked only whether something looked correct. He asked what everyone else had decided was too small to notice. Across Manhattan, Grace began another afternoon surrounded by the familiar sounds of clinking dishes, quiet conversations, and steaming coffee. During a brief pause between tables, she opened one of her handwritten index cards. On one side, she had written a quote from an old professor. "Every assumption deserves one honest question." She smiled gently before returning the card to her apron pocket. Moments later, Nathan and Oliver unexpectedly entered the restaurant once again. Grace greeted them with the same warm professionalism she offered every guest. "Good afternoon," she said. "Welcome back." Nathan smiled respectfully. "Good afternoon, Grace." It was the first time he had spoken her name. Grace noticed the difference, but simply handed them menus. While preparing their drinks, she overheard Nathan quietly explaining part of the delayed acquisition to Oliver. "Sometimes people hide important risks inside ordinary language," he said. Oliver thought for a moment. "Like hiding something valuable inside a plain box." Nathan smiled. "Exactly." Grace paused only briefly before placing fresh coffee on the table. She spoke carefully, never intending to interrupt. "Sometimes it is not hidden on purpose." Nathan looked up. Grace continued gently. "Sometimes people stop looking because they believe they already found the answer." Nathan slowly nodded. "That may be even more dangerous." Grace offered a polite smile before continuing to another table. She never realized how deeply those few words settled inside him. Later that afternoon, a call arrived from Nathan's chief financial officer. The newly discovered amendment confirmed that postponing the acquisition had protected the company from an agreement that could have limited future control. Several executives congratulated Nathan for insisting upon another review. He accepted none of the praise. Quietly ending the call, he looked across the restaurant toward Grace, who was patiently helping a young boy solve a simple math puzzle printed on the children's menu while his exhausted mother enjoyed a few peaceful minutes. She celebrated the child's correct answer with genuine enthusiasm before walking away carrying another tray. Nathan understood something that no financial statement could measure. Grace did not reserve her intelligence for extraordinary moments. She used it every day to make ordinary lives a little brighter. Watching her disappear into the steady rhythm of the dining room, he realized the greatest investment he had discovered all year was not a company, a market, or a contract. It was the remarkable potential hidden inside someone the world had almost overlooked. Several days later, the answer Nathan Cole had been searching for arrived from the least expected place. It was not hidden inside another financial report or buried beneath legal language. It came from a conversation Oliver overheard while waiting near the restaurant entrance after school. Grace had stepped outside during her short afternoon break to answer a phone call. Her voice remained gentle, but Oliver noticed the warmth that immediately filled her expression. "How did your exam go?" she asked. A cheerful voice answered through the phone loudly enough for a few words to carry across the quiet sidewalk. Grace smiled with obvious relief. "I knew you could do it. Keep working hard. One day you will finish what I could not." She listened for another moment before quietly saying, "Do not worry about me. I am exactly where I need to be right now." After ending the call, she remained still for a few seconds, looking toward the busy Manhattan street before returning inside to continue her shift. Oliver mentioned the conversation to his father while they waited for dessert. Nathan did not respond immediately, but the words stayed with him throughout the evening. The following afternoon, his assistant entered his office carrying one final public record she had located through an archived university newsletter. "I think this explains why Grace left school," she said softly. Nathan opened the article and read every line in complete silence. Years earlier, Grace had been recognized as one of the university's most promising finance students. Shortly before graduation, her younger brother had developed a serious long-term medical condition that required continuous treatment and daily care. Their parents had already passed away several years before, leaving Grace as his only legal guardian. She quietly withdrew from the university, accepted multiple jobs, and devoted herself to supporting her brother while continuing to study on her own whenever time allowed. There had been no public fundraising campaign, no interviews, and no requests for sympathy. She had simply adjusted her life without complaint. Nathan slowly lowered the article. Every assumption he had once made about success suddenly felt painfully incomplete. He remembered asking whether she even understood a financial report. He now realized she had been carrying responsibilities far greater than any balance sheet could measure. That evening, Nathan drove home earlier than usual. Oliver noticed his father unusually quiet during dinner. Finally, Nathan looked across the table. "Do you remember asking why someone like Grace works in a restaurant?" Oliver nodded. Nathan smiled gently, though sadness rested behind his eyes. Sometimes people do not leave their dreams because they stop believing in them. Sometimes they pause those dreams because someone they love needs them more. Oliver looked down at his plate before quietly asking, "Will she ever get another chance?" Nathan thought carefully before answering, "I hope so." At nearly the same hour, Grace sat beside her brother in a small rehabilitation center after finishing work. They laughed together over a simple card game while the evening sun painted long golden reflections across the window. Her brother apologized for becoming such a burden all those years ago. Grace immediately shook her head. "You were never a burden." She smiled with complete sincerity. "Family is never the reason dreams disappear. Family is often the reason dreams become worth protecting." As they continued laughing together, neither of them knew that across the city a billionaire had finally discovered the missing chapter of her story. It was not a story about lost ambition. It was a story about quiet sacrifice, unwavering responsibility, and a kind of strength that never asked anyone to notice it. Nathan Cole did not return to the restaurant the following day. He believed that if he truly respected Grace Miller, the next step should not be another unexpected test or another conversation across a dining table. Instead, he chose patience. He instructed his human resources director to prepare information about an upcoming analyst development program that accepted external applicants through the same competitive process used for every candidate. There would be no special invitation, no hidden advantage, and no private arrangement. If Grace ever entered the program, it would be because her ability earned the opportunity. Meanwhile, Grace continued living exactly as she always had. She finished early breakfast service before taking the subway across town to visit her younger brother at the rehabilitation center. They shared coffee from the small visitor lounge while discussing his recent progress. "The therapist says I am getting stronger every week," he said with quiet pride. Grace smiled warmly. "I never doubted that." He noticed the familiar finance textbook resting inside her canvas bag and laughed softly. "You are still carrying that book everywhere." Grace gently touched the worn cover. "Some dreams deserve patience." Her brother became thoughtful. "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" Grace looked through the window where autumn leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk. "Sometimes," she admitted honestly. "But wishing does not change yesterday. Learning prepares tomorrow." Later that afternoon, she returned to the restaurant and resumed another busy shift. During a quiet moment, the restaurant manager approached with a small envelope that had arrived by courier earlier that morning. "This is for you," he said. "No return address." Grace thanked him, but waited until her break before opening it. Inside, she found a simple brochure describing Cole Capital's annual financial analyst development program. There was no personal letter, no recommendation, no signature. A single sentence had been highlighted with a blue pen. "Applications are evaluated anonymously based on knowledge, reasoning, and integrity." Grace read the sentence twice before carefully placing the brochure back inside the envelope. She never assumed it had been sent specifically by Nathan, but she immediately appreciated one detail. Whoever mailed it believed she deserved an opportunity, not a favor. That evening, Nathan received a short message from his human resources director confirming that the program announcement had been distributed publicly and that applications would remain open for another 3 weeks. Nathan quietly closed his laptop without asking whether Grace would apply. He understood that the decision belonged entirely to her. Oliver entered the study carrying another drawing from school. This time he had sketched two paths leading toward the same sunrise. Nathan smiled. "Tell me about it." Oliver placed the picture on the desk. "One path is short and smooth. The other is longer and harder." Nathan nodded. "Which one reaches the sunrise?" Oliver smiled. "Both of them. They just arrive at different times." Nathan looked at the drawing for several quiet moments before placing it beside the acquisition report that had started everything. Across Manhattan, Grace sat beside her apartment window after finishing another long day. She removed the brochure from the envelope and read every requirement carefully. Academic reasoning tests, written analysis, case studies, multiple interview rounds. Nothing promised success. Nothing guaranteed acceptance. She slowly smiled. For the first time in many years, someone had not offered her sympathy. Someone had offered her a fair chance. Grace folded the brochure neatly and placed it inside the same worn finance textbook she had carried through countless subway rides, restaurant shifts, and quiet evenings. Outside, the city continued rushing toward tomorrow. Inside the small apartment, a forgotten dream quietly opened its eyes once again, not because someone rescued it, but because someone finally believed it deserved to stand on its own merit. Grace Miller did not submit her application immediately. She believed important decisions deserved quiet reflection instead of emotional excitement. For 3 evenings, she reread every requirement inside the brochure after returning home from the restaurant. She highlighted deadlines, reviewed sample case studies online through the public library, and compared the program expectations with the notes she had carefully collected over the years. Nothing about the application frightened her. What unsettled her was the possibility of believing in a dream again after teaching herself to live without expecting one. On the 4th evening, she opened her laptop, completed every section honestly, listed her unfinished university education exactly as it had happened, and described her years working in the restaurant without embarrassment. She did not attempt to explain her sacrifices or ask for sympathy. She simply wrote the truth. Before pressing the final submission button, she quietly whispered to herself, "Whatever happens, let it happen because of who I am, not because someone feels sorry for me." Then she submitted the application and closed the computer without allowing herself to imagine the outcome. Several days later, the first assessment arrived by electronic mail. The examination measured analytical reasoning, ethics, business judgment, and financial interpretation. Grace completed the entire assessment from a quiet computer station inside the public library after finishing her morning shift. She worked carefully, never rushing, occasionally closing her eyes for a few seconds before answering the most difficult scenarios. When the final confirmation appeared on the screen, she thanked the librarian, returned the borrowed reference books, and walked back to the restaurant as though nothing unusual had happened. Across the city, Nathan Cole attended a meeting reviewing anonymous applicant statistics for the development program. Company policy prohibited executives from viewing candidate identities until every written evaluation had been completed. Nathan insisted that the policy remain unchanged. "The process stays fair," he reminded the committee. "Talent deserves impartial judgment." He never asked whether Grace had applied. He refused to place his personal curiosity above the integrity of the opportunity itself. Later that afternoon, Oliver visited his father's office after school. He noticed the brochure still resting beside the acquisition report. "Do you think she signed up?" he asked. Nathan smiled thoughtfully. "I honestly do not know." Oliver looked surprised. "You could probably find out." Nathan gently shook his head. "I could, but if I truly respect her, I should wait until the process speaks for itself." Oliver nodded slowly. "That sounds harder." Nathan laughed quietly. "Respect often is." A week later, the evaluation committee gathered to discuss the highest-scoring anonymous candidates. One evaluator projected several identification numbers onto the conference room screen. Candidate A17 achieved the highest overall analytical score we have recorded in the past 5 years, she announced. Another evaluator added, "The written ethics assessment was equally impressive. Every recommendation balanced financial performance with long-term trust instead of short-term profit." Nathan listened silently, making no assumptions about the identity behind the anonymous number. He simply appreciated the quality of the work being described. Meanwhile, Grace finished another evening serving customers before returning to her apartment beneath a sky filled with gentle autumn rain. She unlocked her mailbox, expecting only utility bills and advertisements. Instead, she found a simple envelope bearing the logo of Coal Capital. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she carried it upstairs without opening it. Inside her apartment, she placed the envelope beside the familiar finance textbook and quietly made herself a cup of tea before finally breaking the seal. She unfolded the letter slowly, took one calm breath, and began reading the first sentence beneath the warm light of the small desk lamp, unaware that the next few lines would quietly begin changing the direction of a life she had rebuilt one patient day at a time. Grace Miller stood motionless beside the small kitchen table, reading the letter once, then a second time to make certain she had understood every word correctly. She had been invited to the final interview stage of Coal Capital's Financial Analyst Development Program. The letter explained that her written assessment ranked among the strongest submissions received that year. There was no mention of sympathy, charity, or special consideration. Every sentence referred only to her analytical reasoning, ethical judgment, and decision-making process. Grace slowly folded the letter and closed her eyes for a brief moment. A quiet smile appeared, not because she believed she had already succeeded, but because someone had evaluated her mind before seeing her resume or her apron. The following morning, she visited her younger brother before work and placed the letter on the small table beside his breakfast tray. He read every line carefully before looking up with unmistakable pride. "You earned this," he said. Grace smiled gently. "I earned the chance to try." Her brother laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Grace reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "No matter what happens in the interview, nothing changes the years we have already lived. We have already won more important battles." Later that afternoon, she finished another restaurant shift before returning home to prepare. She reviewed financial case studies, practiced explaining complex ideas in simple language, and reread the handwritten notes she had collected over countless evenings. She did not memorize clever answers. She prepared herself to think honestly. Across Manhattan, Nathan Cole received an update from the program director. "The final interviews begin tomorrow morning," she explained. Nathan nodded. "Remember the policy. No executive receives candidate identities until each interview concludes." The director smiled. "That rule was your idea." Nathan answered quietly. "It is still the right one." The next morning, Grace arrived at Coal Capital wearing a simple navy business suit she had carefully preserved from her university years. It fit perfectly despite the passing time. She carried the same worn canvas bag, though the familiar black apron remained folded neatly at home. The receptionist welcomed her warmly before directing her toward the waiting area, where other finalists quietly reviewed notes or adjusted their ties. Grace instead opened her old finance textbook to a page marked years earlier. Written in the margin were 6 simple words. "Stay curious. Stay humble. Tell the truth." She smiled softly before closing the book. Inside the interview room, 3 senior evaluators greeted each candidate in turn. Nathan observed the process from another conference room through anonymous score summaries appearing after every interview rather than live conversations. He refused to influence the outcome. Nearly an hour later, the evaluation committee assembled to discuss the finalists. One evaluator spoke first. Candidate A17 remained the strongest performer. Another added, "Her financial analysis was exceptional, but what impressed us most was her answer to the ethics scenario." Nathan quietly listened as the evaluator continued. When asked whether she would sacrifice long-term employee trust to improve short-term shareholder value, she answered, "Numbers explain performance. Character determines whether performance can be sustained." Silence settled over the room. Nathan recognized those words immediately. They carried the same quiet wisdom he had first encountered across a restaurant table. Only after every score had been finalized did the committee open the sealed candidate identities. The program director looked down at the list, smiled with genuine surprise, and gently spoke the name that transformed several weeks of quiet admiration into undeniable truth. Candidate A17 is Grace Miller. Grace Miller quietly thanked every member of the interview committee before leaving the conference room with the same calm dignity she had carried into it. She neither celebrated nor questioned her performance. She simply believed she had finally been seen for who she truly was. As she walked through the lobby of Cole Capital carrying her worn canvas bag, she noticed Nathan Cole standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. For a brief moment, they simply looked at one another. Neither spoke first. The silence carried far more meaning than the conversation that had begun their story weeks earlier. Nathan walked toward her with a respectful smile. "Congratulations," he said warmly. Grace tilted her head slightly. "The results have already been announced." Nathan gently shook his head. "Not officially, but the interviews have concluded, and I am finally allowed to know who candidate A17 was." Grace smiled softly. "I understand." Nathan looked directly into her eyes. "I owe you an apology." Grace remained silent, allowing him to continue. "The first day we met, I looked at your apron before I listened to your words. I asked whether you understood something because I assumed your job defined your knowledge." He paused before speaking again. "I was wrong." Grace's expression remained gentle. "Thank you for saying that." Nathan lowered his voice. "You also saved my company from making a very expensive mistake." Grace smiled with quiet humility. "I only noticed something that seemed important." Nathan laughed softly. "Exactly. You noticed what everyone else overlooked." At that moment, Oliver stepped out of the nearby elevator carrying a small envelope. He walked directly toward Grace with the same open smile she remembered from the restaurant. "I made something for you," he said. Grace accepted the envelope with genuine surprise. Inside rested a carefully folded drawing. It showed a quiet waitress wearing a black apron standing beside a woman in a navy business suit. Above both figures, Oliver had drawn the same sunrise. Beneath the picture, he had written only one sentence: "She never changed." The world finally noticed. Grace looked at the drawing for several silent seconds before carefully folding it again. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will keep this." 1 week later, the official program results were announced. Grace had earned one of the highest final scores and accepted a place in the Analyst Development Program through the same competitive process as every other participant. On her final afternoon at the restaurant, her co-workers gathered briefly before the lunch rush to wish her well. The restaurant manager handed her the neatly folded black apron she had worn every day. "Take it with you," he said kindly. "You earn much more than a new job here." Grace smiled gratefully. "This apron reminded me every day that serving people with respect is never small work." She folded it carefully and placed it inside the same canvas bag beside her old finance textbook and Oliver's drawing. Several months later, Grace walked through the headquarters of Cole Capital wearing a simple professional suit, carrying the same quiet confidence she had always possessed. Her office had changed. Her title had changed. Her purpose had not. She still listened before speaking. She still questioned hidden assumptions. She still treated every employee with the same kindness she had once shown every restaurant guest. Occasionally, Nathan passed her office and remembered the afternoon he had asked one careless question across a restaurant table. He had believed he was testing a waitress. Instead, life had quietly tested him. Every important decision he made afterward carried one invisible reminder: never confuse someone's position with someone's potential. Somewhere inside her desk drawer, Grace kept 3 simple things together: the worn finance textbook, the neatly folded black apron, and a child's drawing beneath a rising sun. Together, they reminded her that true intelligence does not become valuable on the day the world recognizes it. It was always valuable. Recognition simply arrives later than truth.